David sat in his living room, his eyes fixed on his son Daniel. The teenager was sprawled across the couch, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his smartphone. David couldn't help but notice the distant look in Daniel's eyes, a far cry from the vibrant, animated boy he used to be. The constant presence of technology in Daniel's life worried David. Was it pulling his son further away from reality, or was it merely a symptom of something deeper? If you love your family and want to listen to amazing and shocking stories, click on subscribe and avoid 20 years of bad luck in your life. As David watched, he recalled the countless times he'd seen Daniel in this exact position over the past few weeks. Ever since Ryan's death, it seemed like Daniel had retreated into a digital world, perhaps seeking solace in the endless stream of information and distraction. David wondered if this was Daniel's way of coping with the loss of his best friend, or if it was a sign that he was struggling to process his grief. Later that evening, as they sat at the dinner table, David decided to broach the subject casually. He cleared his throat and asked, "So, Daniel, how are things going with your friends at school? Any plans for the weekend?" Daniel barely looked up from his plate, pushing his food around with his fork. "It's fine," he mumbled, his voice devoid of emotion. "Nothing much going on?" David pressed on, trying to keep his tone light. "Come on, there must be something. What about that new movie that just came out? I thought you and your friends were excited about it." Daniel shrugged, still not meeting his father's gaze. "I guess we were. I don't know. Maybe we'll go see it sometime." The evasive answers only served to heighten David's concern. He remembered a time when Daniel would eagerly share every detail of his day, his eyes lighting up as he recounted adventures with Ryan and their other friends. Now, it felt like pulling teeth just to get a simple response. As the silence stretched between them, David's mind raced. He knew that grief could manifest in many ways, especially in teenagers, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Daniel's behavior than simple withdrawal. Was he hiding something? Was there trouble at school that he wasn't aware of? David tried one more time. "You know, if there's anything you want to talk about, I'm here. Anything at all." For a brief moment, Daniel's eyes flickered up to meet his father's. There was a flash of something, pain, perhaps, or fear, before the mask of indifference slipped back into place. "I know, Dad. Thanks. I'm just tired. Can I be excused?" With a sigh, David nodded, watching as Daniel quickly cleared his plate and disappeared back to his room. The door closed with a soft click, leaving David alone with his thoughts and growing worry. That night, as David lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he made a decision. He couldn't stand by and watch his son drift further away. If Daniel wouldn't open up to him, then he would have to take matters into his own hands. The next time Daniel went out at night, David would follow him. The plan formed quickly in David's mind. He would need to be careful not to be spotted. Daniel was observant, and the last thing David wanted was to breach the fragile trust between them. He rummaged through his closet, finding an old raincoat that he rarely wore, perfect for blending into the shadows. A small flashlight completed his covert kit. As he prepared for his impromptu surveillance mission, David couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. Was he overreacting, invading his son's privacy? But the image of Daniel's distant eyes and the memory of his evasive answers steeled David's resolve. Something was wrong, and as a father, it was his job to figure out what it was and help his son through it. Little did David know that his decision to follow Daniel would lead them both down a path neither could have anticipated, uncovering secrets that would challenge their relationship and change their lives forever. The night air was crisp as David trailed Daniel through the quiet streets. His heart raced with a mixture of anticipation and guilt. He never imagined he'd be sneaking around in the dark, following his own son like some amateur detective, but as he watched Daniel's silhouette move purposefully ahead, David knew he had made the right choice. Their journey took an unexpected turn when Daniel veered off the main road and headed towards the local cemetery. David's breath caught in his throat. Of all the places he had imagined Daniel might go, this wasn't one of them. He hesitated for a moment, then steeled himself and followed, careful to stay hidden in the shadows cast by the towering oak trees that lined the cemetery's perimeter. As they entered the graveyard, David's footsteps became even more cautious. The crunch of gravel under his feet seemed deafening in the stillness of the night. He found a large tree to hide behind, its thick trunk providing ample cover. From this vantage point, he could see Daniel clearly without risking detection. Daniel moved with purpose, weaving between the headstones until he reached a particular grave. Even from a distance, David recognized it immediately. Ryan's final resting place. He watched, heart aching, as Daniel knelt before the tombstone. In the pale moonlight, David could see his son placing a bouquet of colorful flowers at the base of the grave. The gesture was so tender, so full of care, that David felt his eyes welling up with tears. He strained to hear as Daniel began to speak, his voice a low murmur that barely carried on the night air. "Hey Ryan," Daniel said softly, "I brought your favorites. Remember how we used to joke about you being the only guy we knew who could name every flower in your mom's garden?" David remained motionless, transfixed by the scene unfolding before him. He watched as Daniel traced the letters of Ryan's name on the headstone, his fingers lingering on each carved line. "I miss you, man," Daniel continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Everything's different now. I don't know how to do this without you. How to be me without you here." As Daniel continued to speak to his departed friend, David felt a wave of emotions wash over him. Pride in his son's loyalty and love, sorrow for the pain Daniel was clearly experiencing, and a deep, aching nostalgia that took him by surprise. Unbidden, memories of his late wife flooded David's mind. He remembered her laugh, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. He thought of how she had always encouraged the boys' friendship, inviting Ryan over for dinner countless times and treating him like a second son. "Those two are going to be friends for life," she had once said, watching Daniel and Ryan play in the backyard. The memory of her words now felt like a cruel twist of fate. David found himself transported back to those happier times. He could almost smell the aroma of his wife's famous lasagna wafting from the kitchen, hear the boys' laughter as they chased each other around the house. The weight of those memories, the stark contrast between then and now, hit David like a physical blow. He leaned against the tree, suddenly needing its support to remain upright. The pain of his own loss, which he had pushed aside to focus on Daniel, came rushing back. He realized that in trying to help his son cope with grief, he had neglected his own healing process. As he watched Daniel continue his one-sided conversation with Ryan, David made a silent vow. He would find a way to bridge the gap between them, to help Daniel through this dark time. But he also promised himself that he would allow space for his own grief, recognizing that healing was a journey they both needed to undertake. The night wore on, and eventually, Daniel rose to his feet. He placed a hand on top of the headstone, a final gesture of farewell, before turning to leave. David waited until his son was out of sight before emerging from his hiding place. Approaching Ryan's grave, David felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. He knelt where Daniel had been, running his fingers over the fresh flowers. In that moment, he made a decision that would alter the course of their lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The following day, David woke early, his mind still reeling from the events of the night before. He knew he needed to take action, to find a way to connect with Daniel and help him through his grief. After some contemplation, he decided to leave a card at Ryan's grave, hoping it might open a channel of communication between him and his son. David carefully selected a simple, elegant card from his desk drawer. He sat at the kitchen table, pen poised over the blank interior, wondering what words could possibly convey the depth of his feelings. After several false starts, he finally wrote, "Daniel, I know how much Ryan meant to you. His loss is felt deeply by all who knew him, including me. You're not alone in this. Whenever you're ready to talk, I'm here. Love, Dad." That afternoon, while Daniel was at school, David made his way back to the cemetery. He placed the card against the base of Ryan's headstone, weighing it down with a small stone to prevent it from blowing away. As he stood there, he hoped that this small gesture might be the first step towards healing for both of them. Over the next few days, David watched Daniel closely, looking for any sign that he had found the card. He noticed subtle changes in his son's behavior, fleeting moments where Daniel seemed about to say something, only to retreat back into silence. It was frustrating, but David reminded himself to be patient. One evening, as they sat in the living room, David decided to broach the subject of grief directly. "Daniel," he began cautiously, "I've been thinking a lot about loss lately, about how it affects us and how we cope with it. I wondered if you might want to talk about it." Daniel's response was immediate and defensive. "What's there to talk about, Dad? It sucks. Ryan's gone. That's it." He turned away, his body language clearly signaling that the conversation was over. David felt a pang of disappointment, but he didn't push further. He knew that forcing the issue might only cause Daniel to withdraw more. Instead, he changed the subject, talking about mundane things like school and upcoming events, all the while feeling the weight of the unspoken words between them. As the days passed, David continued to make gentle attempts at opening a dialogue about grief and loss. Each time, Daniel shut down, sometimes with anger, sometimes with quiet withdrawal. It was a dance of approach and retreat that left David feeling increasingly frustrated and helpless. One afternoon, while browsing a local bookstore, David came across a book about dealing with grief. The cover promised insights into the grieving process and strategies for coping with loss. On impulse, he bought it, hoping it might provide some guidance. That night, after dinner, David settled into his armchair with the book. Daniel was sprawled on the couch, seemingly absorbed in his phone. Taking a deep breath, David began to read aloud. "Grief is not a linear process," he read. "It's a complex journey that can involve a range of emotions, from sadness and anger to guilt, and even moments of joy." He glanced up, noticing that Daniel had lowered his phone slightly, though he was still pretending not to listen. Encouraged, David continued reading, his voice steady and calm. He read about the stages of grief, about how everyone's experience is unique, and about the importance of allowing oneself to feel and express emotions. As he read, David interjected his own thoughts and experiences, relating the book's content to his own grief over losing his wife. It was the first time he had spoken so openly about his own loss, and he found the words coming more easily than he had expected. "You know," he said during a pause in his reading, "there are days when I still expect to see your mom walk through that door. It's been years, but sometimes the loss feels as fresh as it did the day she died." He saw Daniel shift slightly, his attention now fully on his father's words. Taking this as a positive sign, David pressed on, sharing more of his own struggles with grief and the ways he had found to cope. As the evening wore on, David continued to read and share, creating a space where grief could be discussed openly and without judgment. Though Daniel didn't contribute much verbally, his body language changed. He sat up, his phone forgotten beside him, his eyes occasionally meeting his father's. It wasn't a breakthrough, not yet, but it was a start. David had found a way to broach the subject that didn't feel threatening or invasive to Daniel. He had opened a door, and now all he could do was hope that, in time, Daniel would choose to walk through it. As he closed the book for the night, David felt a glimmer of hope. They had a long way to go, but for the first time since Ryan's death, he felt like they might be moving in the right direction. Together, they might find a way through the darkness of grief and towards healing. Over the next few days, David continued his evening ritual of reading aloud from the grief book. At first, Daniel maintained his stance of feigned disinterest, but David noticed subtle changes in his son's behavior. Daniel began to linger in the living room during these reading sessions, his attention gradually shifting from his phone to his father's words. One evening, as David was reading a passage about the importance of remembering and honoring lost loved ones, Daniel surprised him by speaking up. "Do you think," Daniel began hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper, "that Ryan knew how much he meant to us?" David paused, carefully considering his response. "I believe he did," he said softly. "The way you two were together, the friendship you shared, it was special. That kind of bond doesn't exist without both people knowing its value." Daniel nodded, his eyes distant. "I keep thinking about things I wish I'd said to him, stuff that seemed stupid or embarrassing at the time. But now you wish you'd said them," David finished for him. "Yeah," Daniel agreed, meeting his father's gaze for the first time in what felt like ages. This small exchange marked a turning point in their relationship. Though Daniel didn't suddenly become an open book, he began to ask questions more frequently, showing a growing interest in understanding grief and how to navigate it. Encouraged by this progress, David suggested they start a new tradition. "What do you think about visiting Ryan's grave together?" he proposed one evening. "Maybe on the first Sunday of each month? We could bring flowers, share stories about him." To David's surprise and relief, Daniel agreed without hesitation. "I'd like that," he said simply. And so, on the first Sunday of the following month, father and son made their way to the cemetery together. As they approached Ryan's grave, David noticed Daniel's steps falter slightly. He placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, offering silent support. They stood before the headstone. The colorful bouquet of flowers they'd brought a stark contrast to the somber gray of the stone. After a moment of silence, David spoke. "You know, I remember the first time Ryan came over to our house," he began, a small smile playing on his lips. "You two were, 7 years old? And within 5 minutes, you'd managed to flood the bathroom trying to create an indoor swimming pool for your action figures." A chuckle escaped Daniel, the sound surprising them both. "Mom was so mad," he recalled, his voice tinged with both amusement and sadness. "Oh, she was furious," David agreed. "But do you remember what happened next?" Daniel shook his head, his brow furrowed in concentration. Ryan stepped forward, looked your mom straight in the eye and said, "Mrs. Thompson, it was all my idea. Daniel tried to stop me, but I didn't listen. I'm very sorry." David paused, letting the memory sink in. "Of course, we knew it wasn't true. You were both equally culpable. But that was Ryan, always ready to take the fall for his friends." Daniel's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "He was like that right up until the end," he said softly, "always looking out for everyone else." As they stood there, sharing stories and memories, David felt a shift in the air between them. The weight of unspoken grief seemed to lighten, if only a little. They laughed, they cried, and for the first time since Ryan's death, they truly communicated. Before they left, Daniel knelt by the grave, his fingers tracing the letters of Ryan's name. "I miss you, man," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I wish I'd told you more often how much your friendship meant to me." David watched his son, his heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and pride. As Daniel stood and turned to him, David saw a flicker of the old Daniel, the one who hadn't been buried under layers of grief and silence. "Thanks, Dad," Daniel said quietly as they walked back to the car, "for doing this, for understanding." David nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. They drove home in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts, but feeling more connected than they had in months. This visit to Ryan's grave became their ritual, a monthly pilgrimage that allowed them to honor Ryan's memory and, slowly but surely, to heal. With each visit, Daniel opened up a little more, sharing his feelings, his memories, and his struggles with losing his best friend. As the weeks passed, David began to notice other changes in Daniel. He was more present at home, engaging in conversations about his day and his friends. The distant look in his eyes, while not entirely gone, appeared less frequently. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Daniel surprised David by asking about his mother. "What was Mom like when you first met her?" he asked, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. David's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he quickly recovered. "Well," he began, a fond smile spreading across his face. "She was the most stubborn, opinionated, brilliant woman I'd ever met." As David launched into the story of how he met and fell in love with Daniel's mother, he marveled at how far they'd come. The road ahead was still long, and he knew there would be more difficult days. But for the first time since Ryan's death, David felt hope blooming in his chest. Together, they were finding their way through the darkness of grief, towards a future where they could remember Ryan with love and laughter, rather than just pain. As the weeks turned into months, David and Daniel's bond continued to strengthen. Their monthly visits to Ryan's grave became a cherished ritual, a time for reflection and connection. With each visit, the weight of their grief seemed to lighten, making room for fond memories and even moments of joy. One sunny Sunday, as they approached the familiar headstone, Daniel surprised his father by laughing out loud. David looked at him quizzically, and Daniel explained, "I just remembered the time Ryan tried to convince us he could speak fluent French. He spent an entire week spouting gibberish with a terrible accent, insisting it was authentic Parisian slang." David chuckled, recalling the incident. "And you both managed to keep straight faces when he tried to order at that fancy French restaurant downtown." "The waiter's face was priceless," Daniel added, his eyes bright with mirth. As they shared more stories, their laughter echoed through the quiet cemetery. It felt strange at first, almost sacrilegious, to be laughing in such a somber place. But as they continued, both father and son realized that this laughter, these happy memories, were the best way to honor Ryan's life. "You know," David said thoughtfully as they were leaving, "I think Ryan would have loved this. He always did have a knack for bringing laughter into any situation." Daniel nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, he did. I miss that about him." The drive home was filled with more stories and shared memories, not just of Ryan, but of family moments that included him. It was as if a dam had broken, allowing a flood of happy recollections to wash away some of the pain that had been overshadowing them. Back at home, David noticed a marked change in Daniel's demeanor. Instead of retreating to his room as he usually did, Daniel lingered in the living room, chatting about his upcoming week at school and his plans with friends. "There's a new movie coming out next weekend," Daniel mentioned casually. "Some of the guys were talking about going to see it. Would it be okay if I joined them?" David felt a surge of relief and happiness at this simple request. It was the first time in months that Daniel had shown interest in socializing outside of school. "Of course," he replied, trying to keep his voice neutral despite his excitement. "That sounds like fun. Do you need a ride?" As the days passed, David observed more positive changes in Daniel. He was more engaged at home, talking about his classes and his interactions with friends. The constant presence of his phone seemed less oppressive. While he still used it frequently, Daniel was also more willing to set it aside for family time. One evening, as they were clearing the dinner table, Daniel hesitated, then asked, "Dad, do you think it's okay to be happy sometimes, even though Ryan's gone?" David paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think it's not only okay but necessary," he said gently. "Grief is a journey, and part of that journey is learning to live and find joy again. Ryan wouldn't want you to stop living just because he's not here." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing his father's words. "Sometimes I feel guilty," he admitted, "like I'm betraying him by having fun or looking forward to things." David placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. "That's a normal feeling, but it's important to remember that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. We honor Ryan's memory by living our lives fully, just as he would have wanted us to." This conversation marked another milestone in their healing process. Daniel began to allow himself moments of happiness without the crushing guilt that had been weighing him down. He started participating more in school activities and spending time with friends outside of class. However, David couldn't help but notice that there was still something holding Daniel back. Despite the progress they'd made, there were moments when a shadow would pass over Daniel's face, a flicker of pain or worry that he couldn't quite hide. One night, as David was saying goodnight, he caught a glimpse of Daniel staring at an old photo of him and Ryan, his expression unreadable. It was a reminder that while they had come far, the journey of grief was far from over. As he lay in bed that night, David reflected on their progress and the challenges that still lay ahead. He was proud of how far Daniel had come, how they had managed to strengthen their relationship through this difficult time. But he also knew that there was more to be done, more healing to be accomplished. With a mixture of hope and determination, David made a silent promise to himself and to Daniel. They would continue to face this journey together, supporting each other through the ups and downs that were sure to come. And someday, he hoped, they would reach a point where the memory of Ryan brought more smiles than tears, where the love and friendship they had shared outweighed the pain of loss. As he drifted off to sleep, David held on to that hope, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for healing, for growth, and for love. One quiet evening, as David was reading in the living room, he heard Daniel's footsteps approaching. Looking up, he saw his son standing in the doorway, clutching his phone with an expression that was both excited and apprehensive. "Dad," Daniel began, his voice slightly trembling, "I found something I want to show you." He moved closer, sitting down next to his father on the couch. David set his book aside, giving Daniel his full attention. "What is it, son?" Daniel took a deep breath before continuing. "I was going through my old text messages with Ryan. I know I probably shouldn't have, but I just missed hearing from him, you know?" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Anyway, I found this conversation we had about a month before it happened." As Daniel scrolled through his phone, David could see the mix of emotions playing across his son's face. Joy at rediscovering these moments with his friend, and pain at the stark reminder of Ryan's absence. "Here," Daniel said, handing the phone to his father. "Read this." David took the phone, his eyes scanning the text exchange. It was a typical conversation between two teenage boys. Jokes, plans for hanging out, discussions about school and girls. But woven throughout were moments of genuine connection and support. Ryan encouraging Daniel after a tough exam. Daniel cheering Ryan on before a big game. As he read, David felt a lump forming in his throat. These messages were a window into the depth of friendship these two boys had shared. He handed the phone back to Daniel, who was watching him expectantly. "That's really special, Daniel," David said softly. "You two had a remarkable friendship." Daniel nodded, his eyes glistening. "Reading these, it makes me feel closer to him somehow. Like he's not really gone, you know?" David put an arm around his son's shoulders. "He'll always be a part of you, Daniel. The impact he had on your life, the memories you shared, those don't disappear just because he's no longer physically here." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in thought. Then an idea struck David. "You know," he began cautiously, "we could do something with these messages if you'd like. Maybe create some kind of memory book or album for Ryan?" Daniel looked up, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "Well," David explained, warming to the idea, "we could put together photos, print out some of these text conversations, maybe add some stories or memories from you and other friends. It could be a way to celebrate Ryan's life and the impact he had on all of us." As he spoke, David could see Daniel's eyes lighting up. It was the most animated he'd seen his son in months. That sounds really cool, Dad," Daniel said, a small smile forming on his lips. "Do you think Ryan's parents would like it too?" David nodded. "I'm sure they would. It could be a beautiful way to honor Ryan's memory." Over the next few weeks, father and son threw themselves into the project with enthusiasm. They dug out old photo albums, sorted through digital pictures, and reached out to Ryan's other friends and family members for contributions. Daniel took charge of organizing the text messages, carefully selecting conversations that showcased different aspects of their friendship: the humor, the support, the shared dreams, and inside jokes. David was touched to see his son laughing and smiling as he rediscovered these moments. They set up a crafting station in the dining room, spreading out colorful paper, stickers, and other decorative elements. As they worked side by side, cutting and pasting, arranging and rearranging, David marveled at how this project had brought them even closer together. One evening, as they were putting the finishing touches on a particularly poignant page, Daniel suddenly stopped and looked at his father. "Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "thank you for doing this with me. For everything, really. I don't think I could have gotten through this without you." David felt his heart swell with love and pride. He pulled Daniel into a tight hug, words failing him for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was husky with unshed tears. "I'm so proud of you, son. You've shown such strength and resilience, and I want you to know that you've helped me too. We're in this together, always." As they returned to their work, David felt a sense of peace settle over him. The memory book was more than just a tribute to Ryan. It had become a symbol of their journey through grief, a testament to the healing power of love and shared memories. The project wasn't just helping them process their grief. It was also allowing them to rediscover the joy in Ryan's life and in their own. With each page they completed, each story they shared, they were not just remembering Ryan. They were celebrating him. And in doing so, they were learning to celebrate life itself once again. As the memory book neared completion, David could see a change in Daniel. There was a new lightness to his step, a spark in his eye that had been missing for so long. While the pain of loss was still there, it was now balanced by the warmth of cherished memories and the strength of enduring love. The memory book project had become a turning point in their healing journey, a bridge between past and future, grief and hope. As they worked together side by side, father and son were not just honoring Ryan's memory, they were building a stronger bond with each other, one that would carry them forward into whatever challenges the future might hold. As the memory book project neared completion, David noticed a shift in their conversations. They began to talk more about the future, something that had seemed almost taboo in the months following Ryan's death. One evening, as they were adding the final touches to the book, David decided to broach the subject directly. "You know, Daniel," he began cautiously, "I've been thinking about your college applications. The deadline is coming up in a few months. Have you given any thought to what you might want to study?" Daniel's hand, which had been carefully arranging a photo, froze mid-motion. He was silent for a long moment, and David could almost see the wheels turning in his son's mind. I don't know, Dad," Daniel finally replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Ryan and we had all these plans. We were going to apply to the same schools, maybe even be roommates. David nodded sympathetically. I remember. You two were always talking about your grand college adventures. Yeah, Daniel said, a sad smile playing on his lips. We had it all figured out, or at least we thought we did. He paused, his brow furrowing. Now, without him, I don't know. It feels wrong somehow, like I'm leaving him behind. David felt his heart ache for his son. He understood all too well the feeling of survivor's guilt, the struggle to move forward when someone you love can't. Choosing his words carefully, he said, Daniel, I want you to know that it's okay to pursue your dreams, even if they've changed. Ryan wouldn't want you to put your life on hold. Daniel looked up at his father, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. You really think so? I know so, David affirmed. Remember how excited Ryan would get when you talked about your future? How he'd go on and on about all the amazing things you were going to do? A chuckle escaped Daniel. Yeah, he was always my biggest cheerleader. Exactly, David said, seizing the moment. Ryan believed in you, in your potential. He'd want you to live up to that potential, to chase your dreams and make the most of every opportunity. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing his father's words. But David could see there was still hesitation in his son's eyes. What is it, son? He prodded gently. What's really holding you back? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently tracing the edge of a photo in the memory book. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I'm scared, Dad. What if I go off to college and I forget him? What if I make new friends and have all these new experiences, and Ryan just fades away? David's heart broke at the pain in his son's voice. He reached out, placing a comforting hand on Daniel's shoulder. Oh, Daniel, he said softly, that's not going to happen. Ryan was such a big part of your life, such an important influence on who you are. You're not going to forget him just because you're moving forward with your life. But how can you be sure? Daniel asked, his voice small and uncertain. David thought for a moment, then said, You know, when your mom died, I had similar fears. I was terrified that as time passed, I'd forget the sound of her laugh, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. But you know what? That didn't happen. Yes, the sharp pain of loss dulled over time, but the important memories, the essence of who she was, and what she meant to me, that never faded. Daniel looked at his father, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. Really, David confirmed. Moving forward doesn't mean leaving Ryan behind. It means carrying him with you, letting the best parts of your friendship inspire you and guide you as you embark on new adventures. As they talked, David could see Daniel processing this idea, wrestling with the conflicting emotions of grief and hope, fear and excitement for the future. I guess, Daniel began hesitantly, I guess I have been thinking about maybe studying psychology. After everything that's happened, I've been wondering if I could help other people deal with loss and trauma. David felt a surge of pride at his son's words. That sounds like a wonderful idea, Daniel. I think you'd be great at that. For the first time in a long while, David saw a genuine spark of excitement in Daniel's eyes as he began to talk about potential schools and programs. It wasn't unbridled enthusiasm. The shadow of grief still lingered. But it was a start, a small step towards embracing the future. As they continued to discuss Daniel's options, David made a silent promise to himself and to Ryan's memory. He would do everything in his power to support Daniel's dreams, to help him navigate the complex emotions of moving forward while honoring the past. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be moments of doubt, of guilt, of renewed grief. But as David watched his son cautiously begin to plan for the future, he felt a renewed sense of hope. They had come so far already, and together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. As they turned back to the memory book, adding the final touches, David realized that this project had become more than just a tribute to Ryan. It was a bridge between past and future, a tangible reminder that it was possible to honor cherished memories while still moving forward into new chapters of life. As autumn leaves began to fall, David and Daniel continued their monthly visits to Ryan's grave. These visits had become a comforting ritual, a time for reflection and connection. However, on this particular Sunday, their routine was unexpectedly disrupted. As they approached Ryan's headstone, both father and son noticed something out of place. A small white envelope was tucked against the base of the stone, partially hidden by the flowers they had left during their last visit. Daniel glanced at his father, confusion evident in his eyes. "Dad, what's that?" David shook his head, equally puzzled. "I'm not sure. It wasn't here last time we came." Cautiously, Daniel knelt down and picked up the envelope. It was unmarked, sealed, and slightly damp from the morning dew. He turned it over in his hands, a mix of curiosity and apprehension on his face. Should we open it?" Daniel asked, looking to his father for guidance. David hesitated. Part of him felt that opening the envelope would be an invasion of privacy. After all, it had been left at Ryan's grave, not theirs. But another part of him, the part that had been trying to help his son heal for months, sensed that this mysterious letter could be important. After a moment's consideration, David nodded. "I think we should. It might be important." With trembling fingers, Daniel carefully opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. As he unfolded it, David moved closer, reading over his son's shoulder. The letter was short, written in a hasty scrawl. "Ryan, I can't keep carrying this secret. I don't know if you can hear me wherever you are, but I need to say this. That night wasn't an accident. There's more to the story, and I can't bear the weight of it anymore. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Jay." As they finished reading, Daniel and David exchanged shocked glances. The implications of the letter were staggering, casting a whole new light on the tragedy they had been grappling with for months. "Dad," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What does this mean? Who's Jay? And what are they talking about?" David shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't know, son, but it seems like there might be more to Ryan's death than we realized." They stood in silence for a few moments, both trying to process this unexpected development. The peaceful cemetery suddenly felt charged with tension, as if the very air around them had changed. "We need to figure out what this means," Daniel said firmly, a determination in his voice that David hadn't heard in months. "We owe it to Ryan." David nodded, feeling a mixture of concern and pride at his son's resolve. "You're right. But we need to be careful. We don't know what we're dealing with here." As they left the cemetery that day, their usual reflective mood was replaced by a sense of purpose and a whirlwind of questions. Who was Jay? What secret were they referring to? And most importantly, what really happened the night Ryan died? Over the next few days, David found himself delving into amateur detective work. He reached out to old contacts, friends who worked in law enforcement, trying to gather any information he could about the circumstances surrounding Ryan's death. Daniel, for his part, threw himself into researching Ryan's final days. He pored over old text messages, social media posts, and school records, looking for any clue that might shed light on the mysterious letter. Their dining room table became a makeshift investigation center, covered in notes, timelines, and photographs. As they worked side by side, David couldn't help but notice a change in Daniel. The cloud of grief that had hung over him for so long seemed to have lifted slightly, replaced by a fierce determination to uncover the truth. One evening, as they were reviewing their findings, Daniel suddenly looked up from his notes. "Dad," he said, his voice tight with emotion. What if we find out something we don't want to know? What if the Ryan we knew wasn't who we thought he was?" David paused, considering his son's words carefully. "Daniel," he began, "no matter what we find out, it doesn't change the Ryan we knew and loved. People are complex. We all have parts of ourselves that we don't show to everyone. But that doesn't negate the good in us or the positive impact we have on others." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing his father's words. I want to remember him the way he was. I'm scared of what we might discover." David reached out, placing a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. "I understand. But remember, we're not doing this to change our memories of Ryan. We're doing this to honor him, to understand the full story of his life and his death." As they returned to their investigation, David felt a mix of emotions swirling within him. There was anxiety about what they might uncover, but also a sense of hope. This search for the truth, as difficult as it might be, was bringing him and Daniel closer together. It was giving them a shared purpose, a way to channel their grief into action. Whatever they discovered, David knew that they would face it together. And somehow, he felt that Ryan would be proud of them for not shying away from the truth, no matter how difficult it might be to confront. As the night wore on, father and son continued their work, united in their quest to unravel the mystery surrounding Ryan's death. Little did they know that their investigation was about to lead them down a path that would challenge everything they thought they knew about Ryan and test the strength of their newfound bond. In the days that followed, David and Daniel's investigation took on a new intensity. They decided to reach out to Ryan's other friends, hoping to gather more information about his final weeks. David made the calls, explaining their discovery of the mysterious letter and their desire to understand what had really happened. One afternoon, as Daniel was sifting through old photographs, David hung up the phone with a heavy sigh. "That was Mike, Ryan's friend from the soccer team," he said, running a hand through his hair. "He mentioned something interesting. Apparently, Ryan had been hanging out with a new group of kids in the weeks before it happened." Daniel looked up, his brow furrowed. "A new group? He never mentioned that to me." David nodded. "According to Mike, Ryan was pretty secretive about it. He'd cancel plans at the last minute, make vague excuses. Mike said he seemed nervous." This new information cast a shadow over their memories of Ryan. Daniel slumped in his chair, his face a mixture of confusion and hurt. "Why wouldn't he tell me about this? We told each other everything." David moved to sit next to his son, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, even best friends keep secrets, Daniel. It doesn't mean Ryan didn't trust you. He might have been trying to protect you, or maybe he was in over his head and didn't know how to ask for help." As they pondered this new development, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Chris, another of Ryan's friends. The message was brief, but intriguing. "Hey, heard you're looking into what happened to Ryan. I think I might know something. Can we meet?" David and Daniel exchanged glances, a mix of anticipation and apprehension in their eyes. This could be the break they were looking for. The next day, they met Chris at a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town. The teenager looked nervous, his eyes darting around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Thanks for meeting us, Chris," David said gently, trying to put the boy at ease. "Whatever you can tell us would be really helpful." Chris took a deep breath before speaking. "About a month before it happened, Ryan came to me. He was scared, said he'd gotten mixed up with some bad people, that he was in trouble." Daniel leaned forward, his voice urgent. "What kind of trouble? Who were these people?" Chris shook his head. "He wouldn't give me details, said it was safer if I didn't know, but he did mention a name once. Jake. Said this Jake guy was the one who got him involved." As Chris continued to share what he knew, David felt a chill run down his spine. The picture emerging was far more complex and dangerous than they had imagined. Ryan, their Ryan, had somehow become entangled with a group involved in illegal activities. On the drive home, the car was filled with a tense silence. Daniel stared out the window, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Finally, he spoke. "Dad, I don't know how to feel about this. Part of me is angry that Ryan kept this from me, that he didn't trust me enough to ask for help. But another part is scared for him, even now," David finished, understanding all too well the turmoil his son was experiencing. Daniel nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, and I can't help but wonder if I had noticed something, if I had pushed harder when he started acting weird, could I have prevented this?" David's heart ached at the guilt in his son's voice. He pulled the car over to the side of the road, turning to face Daniel fully. "Listen to me, son. This is not your fault. Ryan made his own choices for reasons we might never fully understand. You were a good friend to him, the best he could have asked for. Don't let this discovery taint your memories or your love for him." As they sat there, father and son, David realized that their investigation was doing more than uncovering the truth about Ryan's death. It was forcing them to confront complex emotions, to grapple with the reality that even those closest to us can have hidden depths we never suspected. Over the next few days, they continued to piece together the puzzle of Ryan's final weeks. Each new bit of information was like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through their understanding of who Ryan was and what had happened to him. They learned that Jake, the name Chris had mentioned, was a local college student known for throwing wild parties and having connections to the drug scene. They discovered that Ryan had been seen at one of these parties just days before his death. As the reality of the situation became clearer, David watched his son struggle with a roller coaster of emotions: anger, betrayal, sorrow, and a desperate need to understand why Ryan had made the choices he did. One night, as they sat surrounded by their notes and timelines, Daniel looked up at his father, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Dad, I think I need to talk to Jake. I need to hear from him what really happened." David felt a surge of protectiveness. The idea of his son confronting someone potentially dangerous filled him with dread. But he also saw the determination in Daniel's eyes, the need for closure. After a long moment, David nodded. "Okay, but we do this together. We'll find a safe way to approach Jake, to get the answers we need. I promise you, Daniel, we'll get to the bottom of this." As they began to plan their next move, David realized that their journey was far from over. The path ahead was uncertain and potentially dangerous, but he knew that together they had the strength to face whatever truths they might uncover. In seeking to understand Ryan's fate, they were not only honoring his memory, but also forging a new bond between father and son, one built on trust, shared purpose, and the courage to face difficult truths together. The meeting with Jake was arranged through careful planning and a bit of luck. David had reached out to a friend in law enforcement who agreed to be nearby, just in case things went south. They chose a public park for the encounter, hoping the open space would provide safety and prevent any aggressive behavior. As David and Daniel sat on a bench waiting for Jake to arrive, the tension was palpable. Daniel's leg bounced nervously, his eyes scanning the park entrance. David placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, silently conveying his support. Jake arrived looking nothing like the dangerous character they had imagined. He was a thin, nervous-looking young man, with dark circles under his eyes. As he approached, David could see the weight of guilt etched on his face. "You must be Daniel," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ryan, he talked about you a lot." Daniel stiffened at the mention of Ryan's name. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "What did you get him involved in?" Jake sank onto the bench opposite them, running a shaky hand through his hair. "It wasn't supposed to go down like that," he began. "Ryan, he just wanted to make some extra cash, you know? I told him it was an easy job. Just be a lookout for a small deal. I never thought—" As Jake spoke, the full story began to unfold. Ryan had indeed gotten involved with Jake's group, lured by the promise of easy money. But what started as a small job quickly spiraled out of control. The night of Ryan's death, he had been present at a drug deal that went wrong. There had been a fight, and in the chaos— "It was an accident," Jake insisted, tears welling in his eyes. "Ryan tried to break it up, to stop the fight. He got pushed, hit his head on the corner of a table. We panicked. We called for help, but we were scared of getting caught. So we left him there and ran." The revelation hit Daniel and David like a physical blow. The truth was both a relief and a new source of pain. Ryan hadn't been directly involved in anything illegal, but his association with this group had led to his tragic end. Daniel sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down his face. David felt a mix of anger at Jake and his group, and a deep, aching sorrow for the senseless loss of a young life. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. "Before I left that night, I grabbed this from Ryan's pocket. It's for you, Daniel. I've been trying to find a way to get it to you ever since." With trembling hands, Daniel took the envelope. Inside was a small USB drive and a handwritten note. Daniel unfolded the paper and read aloud. "D, if you're reading this, something's gone wrong. I got mixed up in some stuff I shouldn't have, trying to earn money for our college fund. I wanted it to be a surprise, to help out since I know things have been tight. I realize now how stupid that was. I'm going to make things right tonight. Tell Jake and his crew I'm out. Whatever happens, know that you're the best friend I could have ever asked for. Our dreams, our plans, don't give up on them. Live for both of us. Always your brother, R." The park fell silent as the weight of Ryan's words settled over them. Daniel clutched the letter to his chest, his body shaking with sobs. David pulled his son into a tight embrace, his own tears falling freely. Jake stood up, his face a mask of remorse. "I'm so sorry," he said softly. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm turning myself in. Ryan, he deserved better. You all did." As Jake walked away, presumably to meet with the waiting police officer, David and Daniel remained on the bench, holding on to each other. The truth they had sought had brought both closure and new pain, but also an unexpected gift: Ryan's final words of love and encouragement. In the days that followed, they discovered that the USB drive contained a video Ryan had made, full of memories and messages for his loved ones. It was as if he had sensed the danger he was in and wanted to leave something behind, just in case. Watching the video together, David and Daniel laughed and cried, reliving happy moments and hearing Ryan's hopes for their futures. It was a bittersweet experience, but one that helped heal some of the raw wounds left by his loss. The revelation about Ryan's death brought changes. Jake and his group faced legal consequences, providing a measure of justice. Ryan's parents found some peace in knowing the full story of their son's final days. For Daniel, the truth was both painful and liberating. Knowing that Ryan's final act had been an attempt to make things right, and that his involvement had been motivated by a desire to help his friend, allowed Daniel to move forward without the weight of unanswered questions. As summer turned to fall and college application season began in earnest, Daniel threw himself into his plans with renewed vigor. Inspired by Ryan's final message, he was determined to live fully, to pursue their shared dreams with passion. David watched his son with pride, marveling at his resilience and strength. Their journey through grief had been long and painful, full of unexpected turns, but it had also brought them closer together. forging a bond that would endure whatever challenges lay ahead. One evening, as they sat looking through the memory book they had created, now updated with the full story of Ryan's life and death, Daniel turned to his father. "Dad," he said, his voice strong and clear, "I think I know what I want to do with my life. I want to help kids who are struggling, who might be tempted to make the same mistakes Ryan did. I want to make sure his story wasn't for nothing." David felt a surge of love and pride. "That sounds like a wonderful goal, son. Ryan would be proud of you. I know I am." As they continued to flip through the pages of memories, both painful and joyful, David realized that their story, the story of a father and son finding their way through grief and uncovering difficult truths, was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. The road ahead would have its challenges, but David knew that together, they had the strength to face whatever came their way. And somewhere, he liked to think, Ryan was watching over them, smiling at the positive change his life and death had inspired. In the end, their journey had taught them that love transcends death, that truth, however painful, can lead to healing, and that even in the darkest times, there is hope for a brighter future. As they closed the memory book, father and son shared a look of understanding. They were ready for whatever the next chapter might bring.